The Dredge may be one of the most oppressive killers in Dead by Daylight, or is he really one of the biggest illusions? Because if you strip back the darkness and teleports, you see a contradiction that most players don't dare talk about. Today, we're diving in headfirst and understanding why. Welcome to the curious case of the Dredge. Firstly, what makes Dredge such a curious case is the fact that he often feels stronger than he actually is. He has insane mobility through locker teleporting, he has a fantastic anti-loot mechanic in terms of the remnants, and when night falls, it can deteriorate survivors so much that it can turn a trial on its head instantly. And all of that sounds oppressive, which against uncoordinated survivors often is the case. Think about it, if you have a well-placed remnant, it can force survivors to abandon their loot early. As soon as night falls, many survivors panic and make the stupidest mistakes, and if you're mind gaming well as the Dredge, it's quite easy to force survivors to play the way you want them to. And in those moments, Dredge can feel very overwhelming. But some of that strength may be less about his raw power and more about how he punishes uncertainty. And that's a very important distinction for the Dredge, because killers who punish unfamiliarity early on often look like very strong killers, but as you climb the ranks and people start to understand the counterplay more often, your gameplay changes before you even realize it. And when you reach higher MMR levels of Dead by Daylight, the Dredge demands so much more of the player, because survivors suddenly stop feeding the same remnant and they don't greed the tiles in the same way that they used to. A good survivor will recognize that holding W denies way more value from the Dredge than staying at an individual loop, and that matters, because much of Dredge's chase pressure depends on forcing hesitation, and when that hesitation disappears, so does your chances of winning that particular trial. And this is where the Dredge becomes unusual, because his skill ceiling is quite high, but not in the same way as like Blight or Nurse, for example, because once you've mastered those, they can take you through any level of MMR quite easily. But with the Dredge, you have to master his gameplay just so that games can feel consistent, never mind dominate, and that's enough to put off any killer player, whether seasoned or casual. Which brings us nicely onto what is arguably the biggest flaw for the Dredge, and that is map RNG, because his mobility isn't just influenced by map design, it's dictated by it, because unlike most mobility killers, Dredge doesn't have complete control over where his movement takes him. He has limited options that exist, and that's dictated by the map and locker placements. If he gets some good locker placements, he can find that objectives are nearby, and it can turn him into an absolute machine. He can teleport quite naturally from generator to generator, cutting off survivors in the process, and causing nightfalls become more frequent. Suddenly, he's this relentless killer that is dominating in a trial. But if he gets poor locker placements or maps where lockers sit far away from objectives, that same pressure can collapse immediately. And that inconsistency matters to players a lot more than people often realize, because players tend to gravitate towards killers who are strong and they feel reliable in every single trial. So if you have a killer that feels oppressive in one match and then completely different in the next, it just makes it discouraging long term, and a lot of people invest less time into killers that have that flaw. And speaking of dependency, how reliant are Dredge players on particular add-ons? Which begs the question about the Dredge's overall design, because how much of his strongest identity is actually tied to his nightfall power, and how often do players rely on add-ons to make that nightfall appear more frequently? Often in trials, you will find Dredge players bring in Haddie's calendar and Malthinker's skull, and these are add-ons that don't just amplify his power, they often smooth over any pacing problems for the player, making the Dredge feel more consistent match by match. So players are repeatedly using these add-ons just to have a consistent playstyle, which feels more like a design flaw than an actual player skill. What do you think? And finally, we look at his counterplay, because this is where many newer survivors fall short, and the Dredge is actually quite easy to counter. Take locking the lockers, for example. It doesn't remove his power entirely, but that temporary delay can cause so much difference in a trial. It allows survivors to get a head start in their chase, it can be the crucial seconds needed to finish that final generator, and any pressure that the Dredge is building puts in a delay. So rather than compounding the pressure, it's putting the Dredge on on a back foot. Even his Nightfall, for example, which is probably his most oppressive feature. When you're in it, there's visual cues, there's sound cues. I mean, the guy literally glows like a light bulb. So when you stop being horrified by this disorientated experience and really start to understand what's happening, it's so easy to counter the Dredge, which takes away his power instantly. And all of these factors together is what makes the Dredge such a contradiction, because he can be oppressive, he can snowball in games, and he can dominate on very unprepared teams. But in the same breath, his power can rely on map RNG, his strongest moments can be from his add-ons, and experienced survivors can really take him for a ride. Though the question remains, is he a powerful killer, or does he simply punish uncertainty? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed today's video, make sure you drop a like because it helps out so much more than you know. And if you want to catch future deep dives in a bite-sized format on killer analysis, make sure that you subscribe for future content before anybody else. And until next time, I will see you then.